Hello, my name is Paul Schaeflein. I'm a Microsoft MVP for Office Development. In this recording, we'll cover Module 3 of the connectors and actionable messages in the training content. Module 3 focuses on adaptive cards and their use in actionable messages. Our agenda covers adaptive cards, the actions that can be put on those cards, and the code required to handle those actions with. In this first section, we'll discuss an overview of adaptive cards, what they are, why they might be used. Then we'll review the reference of the card schema, as well as a visualizer provided to help us see our cards before we use them. And then we'll talk specifically about how actionable messages implement adaptive cards. Adaptive cards is an open framework, and the goal of this framework is to allow for multiple platforms, multiple applications to render information. You can read all about the goals and the details at adaptivecards.io. It's worth noting that adaptive cards is proposed as an industry standard. It is not a Microsoft thing. It is not an Outlook thing. It is designed to be any application, all multiple platforms. There are 6 high-level goals for the Adaptive Cards initiative, and I want to point out a few key ones. Number 1, portable. Any application, any device, any UI framework, no matter how information is rendered, that we want to have the ability to do that. It's a declarative. This provides a secure environment. Right? I don't have a code executing inside of a host. A developer can define the data that they wish to render, and the actual rendering is handled by the host application. And those host applications are free to render that UI that matches the application. We don't want to have jarring, completing UI frameworks. The adaptive schema is broken down into some high-level properties. We start with a card, right? So we're going to end up at the top having say we are defining an adaptive card. Within a card, I compose it using various elements. Examples of those is a text block or an image. So you can imagine that lets me do full-featured UI. I can subset my card or section into containers. Containers can have a set of columns, a set of facts, which are generally rendered like a table, or a set of images, perhaps in a carousel. I can put actions on a card. The default actions are opening a new URL, submitting data, submitting a form if you will, or showing a subcard to provide some collapsibility as part of the UI. And when I'm submitting information using a submit action, I can have your basic data entry types: text input, numeric, date, time, multiple choice, etc. These high-level properties cover most of the scenarios that you can imagine in any type of system. On the Adaptive Cards website, there is a card visualizer. As you can see in the screenshot on the left-hand side, I can type in a JSON object that has the data that I wish to communicate, as well as these high-level properties regarding containers. On the right-hand side, you can see the rendering in a specific host app. You'll notice at the top there's a drop-down for host applications. This screenshot is showing Windows notifications in a timeline, but there are various other hosts in there, including Outlook and Microsoft Teams. This lets me code the data, focus on the structure of my card, and see how it will look before I go and commit to writing that code. Actionable messages can use adaptive cards in their processing. You'll notice at the top there is an information block that you can certainly send actionable messages to yourself. However, you cannot send an actionable message to a different user until you've registered that. Registration is handled later in this module, but this is a security feature to make sure that I can't just go any willy-nilly and send these cards and have people clicking on actions that may be malicious. Actions will only work if a sender of the card is the same as the recipient, or if the sender has registered with the Office 365 service. Within my email, there's a property saying hide the original body. So I can, if I wish, include a card in my email and then tell the host client to hide the original body text. However, you be careful doing this, right? The body is what's shown if the card doesn't support cards. So you want to make sure that the body exists and that it has relevant information. Maybe not a repeat of all the stuff in the card, but you certainly want to have something there in case the user is using an application that doesn't support adaptive cards. Of note, if I forward a message or I reply to the message, the card is not included. So if the expectation is that the user has to reply to a card, the message body should have information to provide context for the recipient of the reply. The card itself is a JSON object wrapped in a script tag. Right? The script tag has a very specific type that you have to specify, application/adaptive card plus JSON. It is this script tag with this specific type that indicates to the Microsoft Office 365 mail service that this is an adaptive card and we want that rendered using the actionable messages capability. This script tag is added to the head element of an HTML document. You would typically see this in rich emails anyways, in which the mail body is inside the body of an HTML document. So I can combine both the card in the head and the actual text of the message in the body as a single HTML document. This will be familiar to most developers and allows them to get up to speed very quickly using adaptive cards inside actionable messages. So let's switch over and see these capabilities with the visualizer and sending message in a demo. In this demo, I'm going to walk through how I can build an adaptive card in the website and then send it to myself in my mailbox. What you'll see on the screen right now is the adaptive cards sample website. This sample website lists the various different types of cards that you can show, right? There's an activity update, and on the right-hand side, there's a display of the card. But we can make this interactive. If you notice at the bottom, there's a Try It Yourself button. If I click this Try It Yourself button, then I get redirected to the visualizer page. So you'll notice the URL is adaptivecards.io/visualizer. And here you can see that same card listed in a card editor, as well as the interaction. Right? So you notice the card editor has JSON. I have containers of certain sort, and the actual data is then listed down further. I have a full interactivity here. I can make sure it does some basic validation checking. So if I'm missing information, you'll notice I get a parse error. So the visualizer helps me build my card as I needed to see. Up on the right-hand side, you'll notice the Select Host app. This is the default here is the Bot Framework web chat. By dropping down the list, I can choose a different host, and you'll notice Actionable Messages is one of those. Right? And when I do this, I want to point out that you notice there's unknown action type, action.submit. We'll talk in detail about actions later in this module, but beware that you can see that as I'm building the card, I may want to make choices on how I build my card depending on where I expect this to be shown. As another example, inside Microsoft Teams, you'll notice the card seems to work. So if I want to have a card that's portable between the two, I might need to do a different type of action or have it conditionally render or conditionally build my card, depending on the appropriate host. Inside the demo lab files, there is the ability for me to put a different one. So if I click the Load From File button, it will let me navigate to a file on my local drive, and I can then pick that. So we've built a support ticket card, and the idea here is that this has information that could be coming from a help desk to an end user, telling them, a user fills out a help desk ticket in a system, and that system notifies a support agent. And so you can see here we're able to point out that this is a critical issue. I've made it large, I've made it red. I can do that by specifying in my card that the size should be large, and the color is what the attention. If you've used UI frameworks in the past, this will seem very familiar to you. So I have a title, a block here. Further down, I have a facts set section, and I notice facts are a set of key value pairs, if you will. And the way that they're rendered inside the Outlook actionable messages is that I get the type or the title in bold, and then the fact next to it. Right. I'll also point out that the date, if I specify the date using UTC date, as well as a formatting string, the card host will then render it appropriately. And so as a developer, I can just render the date as I expect it to be in my system, and it will be localized to the time zone of the recipient, either in the web page or in their Outlook application. So this is a somewhat full-featured card. I have this ability here. And the one thing that would be interesting is that I could, I want to see how this would look, right? So and then once I have this card built the way I wish it to be done, I can then use the card playground. Now the card playground is something that's built by Microsoft specifically for their Office 365 services. So I will go to the card playground, which is messagecardplayground.azurewebsites.net, and this will then show a very similar experience. However, the card is different, right? So again, I can load a sample. So I will open that same sample in this playground here, right? There are some pre-canned samples I can choose here if I want, right? We've got ours here. Notice the rendering looks similar, but in addition, in this particular website, the card playground, I have the ability to send via email. So I will click on send via email. This will then connect up to Office 365 using the account that I wish, right? So I have a sample account or a test account that I've done here. When I'm first doing this, it says, by the way, this application wants to send mail as you. That's completely what I expect it to do. I want the message card playground to do that. So I will then accept this and grant those permissions, right? I had previously logged in. If you notice, I had my mail open in a different tab, so I didn't have to enter credentials, but I was able to successfully send that message. As we talked about before, the sender is this admin account, the recipient is this admin account, so it works just fine. Here in my mailbox, you'll notice it says Message Card Playground Test Card. It was sent from the Message Card Playground. If I click on that, you'll notice I have my card. Because this was sent from the Message Card Playground, in addition to including the card, that web page is including the message body as well. And the message body here includes the information about what's happening here. But in addition, they show the JSON payload of the card. Right? This does not happen for cards that you send directly from your application. This was specifically included as part of the Message Card Playground, so that as a developer, I can see what values are good, bad, other. And there it is. Now, in this particular example, you'll notice that the images is included as an inline. Right? And so that's why it's a rather large looking card. But I get full capability here to check and see. Again, the point here is I can go to the playground or the visualizer and make sure my information is what I expect it to be. I can change this and tweak it when it's happy the way I like. I can test it when I'm all set. Then I'm ready to go ahead and move that into code. And so what we'll do now next in this module is we'll talk about how we can take these cards and wrap them into code. The next section of this module will discuss card actions. We'll review the Outlook-specific capabilities for adaptive cards, review the actions and input types, as well as the post action that we can do. Outlook introduces a set of card properties and features that they can use for context in the context of actionable messages. Right? The capabilities that Outlook wishes to offer may be different than other mail clients, and so the adaptive card schema allows for us to have additional actions. If a renderer or a host application does not understand an action, it's free to ignore that. And so Microsoft has used this ability to then extend it with quite a bit of functionality that you'd expect to see for letting users interact with their data using the cards. First thing to point out, the time element is not supported, right? Microsoft would rather is telling you to use a text box and validate the time on the server side, which is probably a good idea anyways. Any input data you'll want to validate on the server. So there is no time picker or input.time element supported. The submit card is not supported by Outlook either. This is, however, is less of an issue because they did provide an alternative. Instead of just a submit card, they chose to use Action.Http. And you'll notice when we get into Action.Http, it will allow us to do either a post or a get. So if I want to get information in response to a button click, that would be counterintuitive using the submit action. So Microsoft has this Action.Http in which I can specify the URL and I can specify whether I want to do a get or a post. Now, the typical cautionary tale about don't update information on your server in response to a GET request still applies, but again, we may not necessarily want to just open up or post information. We may want to just get some information. Now, One thing to keep in mind here is that we may want to have the post submit data, and where does that data come from? And that's this concept of input value valid substitution can be done to pass data to the URL. And so as you see, I can have input controls to let a user type in information, and then the value that was entered in that control I can substitute into my post request or my GET request if I wish to do that as well. Outlook also has the ability to run add-ins, and so if I'm running the Outlook client and I can have a button in the toolbar that will open an add-in pane on the right-hand side of my screen. An extension to the adaptive card schema for Outlook provides the same capability. Inside the adaptive card, inside the actionable message, I can have a button that will then open the add-in pane. If the add-in is not installed for the current user, they'll get prompted to install that. And then I can pass data back and forth from my card to the add-in. So in this scenario, I can have a back-end system send a message to a user and then let them interact right inside the add-in that I've previously provided to them. There may be cases in which you want an actionable message to refer to a form, either a message or an appointment inside Outlook. And so I can then have a button inside my actionable message that can then open a calendar item or a message item. And if I'm going to be referring to messages, one thing to keep in mind, typically using adaptive cards or actionable messages in the context of other graph actions. So my application may have created the calendar item, so I'll know its ID, or I may have created that message or access that message using the Microsoft Graph, and so I want to provide that interactivity. That's capable using the Action.Display form capability. The toggle visibility action lets me give a little bit of dynamic or interactivity to my card. Right? Perhaps when I first render the card, I don't necessarily need to show input boxes, but if the user clicks a button that says they want to reply or they want to submit information, in response to them clicking a button, I can open up a further section of the card and let them input that information. This way I can have a card that is display only for executive level, for example, but yet it does allow for details for those who have to provide those details, all within a single card, and let users control what they need to see. Typically, when I do an action element, you'll see if we review the samples, you'll see there is information at the top of a card and then actions at the bottom of the card, which then renders the buttons for those actions at the bottom of the card. But perhaps you don't want the button at the bottom, perhaps you have multiple sets of buttons depending on your card. The action set element lets me put an action button anywhere in the body of the actionable message card instead of just using the default at the bottom. The additional properties you'll notice on the far right-hand side here, there are information that I can add to my card that is supported by Outlook. Specifically, the expected actors lets me specify that when the request comes back from Outlook back to my system, I want to know who am I expecting to see. I should be seeing a certain user. So if I'm sending a message to Paul, the response should come from Paul. If I sent the message to Paul and the response calls from Adam, then perhaps that's a hack, and I don't want to do that. The originator property is required when you register your card through the developer dashboard, and that's a way for Microsoft to enforce who's sending messages. Right? And then there are other additional styling properties that you can be added to the payload that are processed by Outlook that may be ignored in other systems. Next, you'll notice that there are some examples here provided about what you would use inside of actionable messages for Outlook. Right? The open URI action can be a little bit more explicit. Right? By default, the open URI will then open a URL using the default browser. But perhaps if you're on a mobile device and you have an application on that device with its own shortcut registered, its own scheme registered, you can provide an array of targets to the open URI action. And you'll notice here we have a target for each of the platforms. The default is to use the web browser with HTTPS, but we can use the native scheme on the various mobile devices to open that short link in that app. Now, the value that you have to specify for the URI inside of an app has to match the app, so you'll need to understand the inner workings of that app as to how to construct that URI. But assuming you've delivered the app yourself and you're delivering the card, you can certainly make that connection. The HTTP post action in addition to sending information to a URL, in addition, Outlook or Office 365 will include a token in the header, right? And the idea here is that you can then use this token to validate that the request is coming from Office 365. And as we talked before, the action card action will let me show additional information in interactive. The input types, again, these are the types that are listed from the adaptive cards itself, right? So we have text and number, date and time. Of course, now remember that time is not specifically, is explicitly not supported in the Outlook client, but I can certainly have that if a card is going to be in multiple options. Right? The toggle lets you provide a value for when it's on and when it's off. And if you've looked at different toggles in the Office 365 suite, these would be familiar to you. And obviously a choice and a choice set and individual choices will let me choose, right? I can specify a style on a choice, right? And so if I say the style is compact, it's rendered as a drop-down. And if I say the style is expanded, I get radio buttons. And so you get the ability here. And then the other thing, of course, multi-select would allow for checkboxes instead of radio buttons because I'm allowed to choose multiple. So this kind of covers most of the scenarios that you would expect to see for data input. So here's an example of the HTTP action that you can use inside of Outlook. You'll notice that the card type is declared at the top. It's an adaptive card. And in the body of the card, it is an input box with a placeholder that says type your name. And you can see in the right-hand side, it renders an input box with the placeholder value there. And then in the action, we specify a type, a title, the method, and URL. And you'll notice the URL has that input parameter substitution capability I referred to earlier. If you'll notice that the input.text control, the type, its ID is name input. And in the URL with the double curly braces is the replacement and its name input. And then the value property of the name input. So this again is the ability to let me then provide a card in code. I could reuse the same URL, but depending on what the user types in, that information is rendered differently. In this example, that input value substitution is part of the URL property. You can also do that in the body of the message. If you're doing the HTTP post and you're sending a body, you can do the input substitution in the body as well. So let's go through and see how we can generate these cards ourselves and send them off to Outlook. In this next demo, I've returned to the message card playground, and I've loaded a slightly different version of the card. This particular card has just a support ticket as we saw before, but at the bottom there are some input fields for comments. So the scenario here is that I have additional information I want to provide to the support representative by entering a comment. If I look at the body of the adaptive card, you still see the same information we had before. I still have my container of items, and so I will collapse these down until we get down to the bottom. I have another container that's added of type container that has our text block of comments. And so you'll then see we have this, the word comments is shown as this text block, right? Notice the items is an array. I have only one at the moment, but you can imagine as the comments are entered, I will then put additional ones between the word comments and above the box. So I can add additional items to this container to show existing comments. At the bottom, you'll see I have a new actions section added below the input. And if you remember before, we talked about the action set would let me put information in the middle instead of at the bottom. The way this is set up by default, I have a body property and then an actions property, and since the actions are below the body, the actions show up at the very bottom of the card. If I want my button to be somewhere in the middle of the card, I need to use that action set. So inside the actions, you'll see here we're doing a show card. The idea here is, of course, that we would then show information here about the box. Now, that gives us that toggle capability. However, that's not rendered in Outlook at the moment. So I would have to use the toggle visibility action, which I didn't do. But so here is our type of input, and the ID is comment. We allow for multi-line text, and so we have it here, information. Then here is my Action.Http section. This is what renders my button. The text of the button is OK. I'm doing a post, and I'm going to then submit that to a API, right? And so we're using the ngrok utility to provide a proxy. This is detailed within the lab steps. So for now, we'll just put the information here that we need for my ngrok proxy. And so when the button is clicked, it'll do a post to this URL, and here is the headers that it'll send in. So I have to say that I'm submitting an application.json because my web API is going to spec that. And here is the input value substitution that will happen in the body of the message. And so because the input text control has an ID of comment, I reference comment here. I put the whole thing around double brackets, and that will show my information. So I'm going to send this via email one more time. It's successfully sent. And I'm going to go back to here. And so here's my message card playground. And if I scroll down, I can see the comment, right? And if I click comment, it opens it up. And so this visibility action, again, is part of the action.showCard capability, right? Again, the message card playground doesn't show that information, but it does. Each host is unique, right? Now, I don't have to use message card playground to send my card, right? And so what we've opened here is a console application that has been registered with the send mail permissions. And this program simply will run and do prompt the user to log in, right? And once the user logs in, it'll then go through and send the message, right? So it does a send message, right? And in the send message method, it gets a token, like you'd expect, because this is what we call a native client using a public application. It runs with delegated permissions, so the user has to log in. It will then prompt the acquire token will prompt to log in. Once I get a token, it simply is going to create a message and send it. So here's where I create the message. I'm creating a new message with a subject and a recipient, and then the body, the body type is HTML. If you remember, our cards need to be sent as an HTML. The head element of HTML has the card, and the body has the body of the message. So I will then use this helper method to do that. And then we just use our typical Microsoft Graph SDK to send the message. Nothing fancy there. But let's take a look at this load adaptive card method, right? Just for ease of demonstration, we put this card in this card.json file. This is going to look very similar, right? This is the same information that we've been using all along, with one slight little difference. In this card.json, I still have the same information, this card, and what we've done here is I've created a token with $signs with the created date, because when I send this message, I want to use today's date, for example, instead of hard coding the one that we had in the rest of this is the same. All right, this particular one doesn't necessarily have any buttons associated with it. My apologies, it's the older version, but I wanted to at least point out to you that I can, in code, generate this. Right, so I'm going to then read the text. I'm going to replace the created date with the date and time. And then it's going to read the message body file. And the message body, again, is my HTML. Here's the head element with my script. The application type is in here. And then the body has Adaptive Cards Portal, right? Similar to what we saw before. Running this application is as simple as, again, it's going to prompt for my credentials. And it will then send the message and just say hit enter any key to continue. And now we'll go back to Outlook, and if I look here, and now we have adaptive card sent from code. Right? So you can see this one has the date. It's different than what we had hard coded. The hard coded one was previous. So that's letting me send a message through code. A sample there for you. But now, how does this action thing work? I showed you before that I can do comment. Here it is, and so I will just target our standard comment as we get started. Hello world, and I click OK, and Outlook does its thing. Right? But nothing happened yet. Right? What happened is an error. Well, we did an HTTP post to an endpoint. What ended up happening here is the endpoint did not return a 200 response. So therefore, something went wrong. because I'm using the ngrok proxy, I can then see that what happened is the message came in, but a bad gateway. It didn't get routed anywhere. I don't have a web service at the moment. Right? But the reason we do this without the web service running is to show you that the ngrok proxy allows us to view the requests as they come in. Right? And so here is this request, and if I look at it, you can see the raw responsive coming in. Here's the information, right? So I did get a bearer token. Now we'll cover this in more detail, but Office 365 sent a token that I can then use to verify that the sender of this HTTP request is in fact Office 365, and I'm allowed to return data to it. Right? I specified that I wanted application/JSON, and here's the value. And you'll notice that in the value, instead of it saying comment.txt, we now have the actual value that was typed in shown there as well. So this lets the ngrok proxy lets me inspect the requests as they're coming in, and I can handle them accordingly. So given this, how do we go through and handle this action, and what can we do to communicate with our users when they do these types of actions? And we'll cover that in this next section. So let's continue on and review how to handle these actionable messages in your code. We'll talk about the requirements for handling them with registration that's required to make this in production. We'll talk about providing a refresh data or a status back to Outlook, as well as talk about through the security concerns, and then we'll wrap it up with a demo. Microsoft provides an actionable email developer dashboard. The purpose of this dashboard is for you to log in, provide some information about your organization, register an email address as well as URLs that would be used for actionable messages. Again, Microsoft is not going to be just letting anybody send actionable messages with nefarious means into the service, so you have to register the email address from which you will be sending. They will validate the domain. We have a whole slide on the security requirements here. Again, if you're going to be sending to anyone other than yourself, you will then need to register. I can point out that the scope of submission that's kind of hidden here will let you target these messages only for your own domain. So if you're doing in-house development, you wish to support cards throughout your organization, you can register only for your organization instead of making it for the entire Office 365 service. There's a lot of criteria that you have to do with register. Your registration won't be accepted unless these things can be verified, right? So your emails that must be authenticated using the spam protection capabilities. If you're sending from an Office 365 email account, this is taken care of for you. Your email addresses have to come from the address that you register with the service, right? And Microsoft is going to check and make sure that the domain that hosts this email address has a consistent history of sending emails. I can't register a domain today, create an account today, and start sending hundreds of messages. That's very spam-like behavior, and they will make sure that's not working. However, if you have Office 365 or if you have an organization that's been around for some time and has been sending messages, you're less likely to be a spammer, right? You're going to want to make sure that you have what they call high fidelity actions that you're putting in your service, right? The idea here is that I don't want to send an actionable card that's going to then try to replicate a wizard experience and I have to go through 3 forms for a user to complete the action. The idea around actionable message is lightweight, routine, simple action. I'm going to approve an expense report, or I'm going to submit a comment, or I'm going to just view data and then move on. Right? If you need to do something more complex, you should be using the Open URI, which will open a web page, or perhaps use open the add-in capability to let them interact with the app inside the add-in instead of inside the email message. Right? And again, the last item is again saying we're not using this for bulk email. We're using this for transactional, where we expect users to interact. Right? The idea of actionable messages is an interaction with the user, not a broadcast of things to them. So if what you're trying to do is send promotional bulk mail, there are other services and other options for doing that. Again, as you submit your registration before it gets approved, Microsoft will be taking these items into consideration. Well, how do actionable messages work? What's the processing? And at a high level, Outlook is involved. The email comes into Outlook. When I click on a button inside of Outlook, it's going to send a message back to the Office 365 service, which will then interact with your application. The key thing to note here is that Outlook does not communicate directly with your application, nor does your application communicate directly with Outlook. The Office 365 service is going to proxy this conversation all the time to make sure the security requirements are met, make sure the application's been registered, make sure the actions aren't doing anything that it shouldn't be. It's also protecting the user's data and protecting the user's computers. The flow, I think, is easier to see here in this diagram. You can see at some point your application will send an email that has a card attached that goes to the email server, which in this scenario is Office 365 Exchange Online. The email server obviously will then send that message back to the mail client, right? Notice that the heading here says card-enabled mail client. Outlook for the web is card is enabled. Outlook desktop is, I believe, is very close. There's a roadmap. You can see what should the Outlook clients support actionable cards and what their roadmap is. Other mail clients have varying support for actionable messages as well, and for adaptive cards. But in my card-enabled mail client, the user will then click on a button. It'll invoke the HTTP action. And so eventually that HTTP action will get routed to Office 365. Office 365 then turns around and does a post message to your API. And it includes a bearer token. Again, we'll talk about this in depth later, but it is a way for you to validate that the request coming into your application is from Office 365. You do any processing that's required, you're going to report back a status. It can be a simple okay or accepted, or if it's some error happened, you can do that as well. And you can optionally refresh the data that's shown on the card. You can return a payload and say, hey, Outlook, I'd like you to then refresh this card with more information, and it will do that as well. So this gives us a great operation to grab some information from the user, let them interact with our card, and go on. When I'm reporting success or failure, you can see here we do this using the response header. Right? And so if you remember back in the flow, we come back and we are getting an HTTP request to our backend web service. Right? And do some, you can see here's a sample validation that maybe we want to do to make sure that the domain that we get is what we expect. And so you can see the error response has a header of card action status. And I can put in a text there. Whatever text I put in there will be shown to the user. The primary difference here is that you'll notice at the very top, the first section here, the error response has an HTTP status code of forbidden, and the second one has an HTTP status code of OK. So using the built-in HTTP request response status information, I can then communicate to the Office 365 service whether it was a success or a failure. Right? And if it was failed, why? And then in addition, I can send the message or a status if I want as part of that header as well. If I want to refresh the body of the card, I would then send a response that has the adaptive card re-rendered in my response, and I would include a header that says card update in body is true. This is a signal back to the Office 365 service that I have a new card. I'd like you to refresh the card that's displayed to the end user with this new value. You have to reply with an entire full-formed card. And in my scenario, we talked about how we initially would render the card and we let users type in comments. When I respond, I'm going to have to include that comment back to that because there's no state maintained in the email client. It's going to simply replace the card that it showed before with the new one that I return as part of a response in this HTTP action. However, before I do that, I of course want to validate what's happening here. As we mentioned before, there's a bearer token that is sent to your web service as part of these requests. So Microsoft is providing a token validator for you here. There's a NuGet package that you can add to your project. Right? The class is called Microsoft.o365.actionablemessages.authentication.actionable message token validator, which is quite a mouthful, right? Not only is it a NuGet package, but the source code is also available on GitHub as well, so you can look and see exactly what it's doing and tweak it for any of your use cases. What this library will do is it will check that the digital signature is valid, and it will check that that digital signature matches the one that Microsoft expects it to do. So because the way certificates work, obviously we have a public-private key, and as well the token lets me validate the token signature and who issued it. So I can do that. Tokens also have an expiration, so when the request comes in, I call this library, the token expiration is checked. This will help mitigate any man-in-the-middle attack or replay attacks if someone tries to then make that request in the future. And it also checks to make sure that the audience claim, which is part of that request, matches the service domain URL. What that means is I'm hosting a web service at a certain URL, and I've registered that URL with the developer dashboard. And so it will then, Microsoft will then include that URL as part of an audience claim in the token, and the built-in validation will then make sure that the audience specified in the token matches what I expect it to be. If it doesn't match, that could mean that someone is routing a actionable message request or an action from a different service into mine. And again, that's something I don't want to do. And you can see a little code snippet. It's really quite simple to create, new up the validator class, and then just wait on the response to the validate token. You can see what we're passing in is the actual authorization parameter of the request header, which basically means that bearer token. And then I'm saying my name or my URL is api.contoso.com. Make sure the audience matches that for me. Again, a way for us to make sure. Here is a more involved snippet that is going to validate the token, and if the token is not valid, I'm going to return a card response that with the header that says it's an invalid token. Right. So we talked about before how I can communicate status back to the service. So if the token validation fails, I'm certainly going to want to do that too. Right. Now, whether you want to actually say invalid token or some other message is entirely up to you, but this is a more comprehensive method that we would probably want to include, where we're validating the token, then we're doing our custom business logic to validate whatever. So it's quite common that just because the token is valid doesn't necessarily mean that that I can accept the response. Perhaps you can see the example here is that it's checking to make sure that the person who performed the action, right? So that result action performer. And so I should go back a step. If you look, the second line of the method creates a variable called result, which is the result of the token validation. So not only is the validation checking all those information about the token, but it also is giving us a set of parameters. So the result has a sender property and it has an action performer property. I can see who is the user, which mailbox were they doing this performance. This becomes important, for example, if the message gets sent to an Office 365 group message mailbox instead of a specific user. Do you really want that if someone replying to your actionable message from the group mailbox as opposed to an individual mailbox? Right? So I can get the sender property, which would be that mailbox address, and the action performer would be the UPN of the human who is doing that action. Again, you can do whatever validation is necessary for your business logic. Right? So let's go back to demo now, and we'll build up a web service that does these responses as we'd expect. In this demo, we'll be processing Action.Http messages sent to our backend service from an adaptive card inside an actual message in Outlook. I have Outlook open. You can see the message that we sent through the message card playground before that allows for us to enter a comment. Filling in the type box and clicking OK will then post the message to the Office 365 service, which will then redirect that or post that message along with the token to our backend service. We've responded appropriately with a message saying comment recorded. If we dismiss the dialog, you'll see that our comment is now shown. Our service is coded to allow us to do this as often as necessary. So let's review the code and see how we process this. This code is a standard ASP.NET Web API. If you remember our card, we were posting to the ticket controller. So we look here at the Action.Http. We are posting to our ticket controller, passing in the data, right, which is just a comment. So in our web API, you can see is our ticket controller, the post method. And so we have some code at the top here to parse the object directly. This obviously is not necessary, but not necessarily needed for every service, but this helps us to troubleshoot any deserialization issues while we're developing. Next, we have a section where we're pulling the authorization header from the request. As we saw in the slide deck, we can use the library from Microsoft, the Actionable Message Token Validator, to do that token validation for us. When we call this method, we're passing in our web service host, which is that URL that we expect our data to come from. Our web service host we've defined just as a constant in our code at the moment. If that validation succeeds, we get a result message, and this result message has some properties that we can find interesting. In addition to it being just succeeded, we can also see that we have other properties that are helpful to us. We have an action performer, right? The email address of the person who performed the action, as well as the sender, the email address of the sender of the actionable message. Now, since we are sending actionable messages to ourselves, it'll be the same value every time. But if you were coding a system and publishing it in the service, the sender of the message would be your application. So you can verify that information. So if the validation does not succeed, we can return an error message. So you see here we're returning an unauthorized error message if it does not succeed, which is a token validation. Furthermore, we're going to do our own validation to make sure that the correct domain. So we saw this already here. We're checking to see if the sender domain matches our domain. If that fails, we're going to send it was invalid sender. Right? And then we start our business logic validation here. Now, for this demonstration, the business logic is to append comments to a list and show all of them to our users. In a real production application, this would most likely be using a database. But in our scenario here, what we're doing is we're looking to see what the comment is. We're adding it to a collection of comments, and then we're returning the updated card. What's interesting about the demo is that our data is actually being returned to the card as a hidden property, so to speak. Because web services are stateless, where do we store these old comments? So I'm just storing them right into the card. Furthermore, I'm building the card in code because there could be a scenario where maybe you want to have the action be dependent upon the rights of the user or upon the data being set. So we've included in this sample codes as a function to create the card. So if we look at the function here creating the refreshed card, you can see we're pulling in the value of our refresh card, just like we saw in our console app. And so the refresh card will have tokens that we can replace data in, right? And at the bottom, you'll notice we have just a container ID with items, and the item right now just is the word comments in large bold type. This code right here is just our one comment, but we want to add values to that, right? And so if we go back to our code, what we are going to do is build this up, right? We're going to then load this into the adaptive card library. This adaptive card is a NuGet package provided by Microsoft that'll help a .NET SDK for adaptive cards. And with that adaptive card library, we can initialize it by passing in a JSON string. You can also just new up an adaptive card and build it as you would any type of object, but this bootstrapping will help us get started. So we can build our card, and now with our card in here, we are able to use a link expression to just find the comments ID in this card. Right? Once I have the comment ID, I can simply loop through my collection of comments that I have, either from my database or stored in memory or wherever the case may be, and just add them. I'm creating a new text block, right? Separator is true, wrap is true, put the value in there, and I just add those to the container. In addition, I'm adding a little additional information about the action performer and the date. So if we look at the email message, you'll see that every time I did this, it had a different date and time, just minutes later, but it was different. So the Adaptive Card SDK gives us the ability to build these cards as we see fit. Now, there's one other useful piece of code here in this demonstration, this demo code. In addition to building up the action card, we are going to then put our own HTTP action. The adaptive card library uses the standard adaptive cards.io schema, but you notice there's a lot of things that are new or unique to Outlook, right? This action, HTTP action, is one of those types of elements. So this is just a simple little helper method that's going to put this action at the very end. We're going to create a new action named post, and this is where we can decide this is where we're posting back to ourselves. But what's unique about this specific instance is that in addition to outputting the value of just the comment, right, we're also going to output what we have here, a whole thing of cached comments. And what this ends up being is that I'm sticking that data in hidden value. I'm going to switch over to the ngrok, so as you can see as we post each one of these. So the first one that came in here, you'll see the comment. If we look back at the response, what's being sent back is our card. And if I go down past to the bottom, where we see our actual individual items here, you'll notice my action now has the body of a cached comment object is here. And then here is the comment and comment value that we saw originally in the card. So these values that we want, the state that we want to be returned to us on a second invocation of the action, we can just simply put this into the body that gets posted back. You'll notice these cached comments are not shown directly into the card because they are rendered as part of this block here that has the information. And so the net result being that I get a human consumable card. It looks just like they would expect it to look, right? And then obviously the raw data has all the other information that I need. So just to recap, here our simple controller is doing receiving the data. We're going to first of all we're going to make sure we are valid. By doing that, we're going to call into the validation method provided by the library from Microsoft for actionable messages. And then we're going to do our own validation that's necessary for our organization. An example is comparing to make sure that the original actionable message sender matches my domain. I don't want to be processing stuff that's not necessarily relevant to me. I also might want to do some more logic around making sure the data that they're sending is still current. And then I can process it with any business logic that I need, whether it's updating databases or reading information. And then when I respond, I give a card action status. And the card action status can be just a status update message, such as comment updated, or it can be an error message, whatever is appropriate to you. And then add a header for create card update in body set to true, and in the content of the response include the refresh card. That will then force Outlook to redraw the message. So to summarize our module, adaptive cards, an open framework supported by multiple hosts that lets us present information to our users in a clear, concise manner. Outlook's actionable messages can use adaptive cards. In fact, Microsoft is urging those who have been using the legacy message card format to move to adaptive cards. You should be aware that adaptive card actions differ between the various hosts that do those, and Outlook specifically has a very wide range of actions to let us handle many business scenarios. The key scenario around those is that you should update your messages with a status and refresh content after users perform their actions. Hope you found this very helpful. Thank you.